our Tolkien Smith conference. Welcome to all of you to Corpus Christi College. My name is Beppe Pezzini. I'm the tutor and fellow in Latin in this college. I've been here since 2021, but in fact, I came here originally in 2006. And I came here originally because I really wanted to follow Tolkien's footsteps and become a philologist. In a way, I managed to do that to a certain extent, although a classical philologist rather than an Anglo-Saxon philologist, but I'm still, in a sense, grateful to JRT for the inspiration. So today we are going to have a conference on the special relationship between Tolkien and Smith. That's a conference that is organized by myself, Oronzo Cilli, there in the back, and Doug Anderson. And in fact, I'm very sorry that Doug is not here with us today. He has very grave, I would say, personal reasons. He's very ill. It's a bit of a pity because the idea of this conference dates back to a conversation we had with him and also back in last summer. Maybe we can explain later on, but it's very sad that he's not being able to be here with us today. We send him all our thoughts in this, if you want, difficult period of his life. I also want to say straight away that this is the first of a series of events that we are currently organizing in the University of Oxford. There's a team of people, including many who are here with us today. And the idea is to have a series of events to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Tolkien's death, which of course will occur in September this year. So stay tuned. If you have, you've been given a copy of the program, and at the bottom of the program there is an email address. You can use the email address to sign up to the newsletter that we're going to send in the next few months about the forthcoming events. And if you want, we are quite ambitious, so we see what will actually become of our ambition, but the idea would be to do something grand for the whole of 2023-2024. I'm actually quite glad that we are starting this year of celebration with an event dedicated to what I find a very intriguing, paradoxical, beautiful dimension of Tolkien's personality, both human and literary personality, that is to say, his collaborative nature. This is a bit of a paradox because, as we know, Tolkien was in a way very private. His biases were very private to a certain extent, and yet no one can deny that, in fact, Tolkien was a very collaborative person. And to make it very clear, I wanted to start reading a quote from one of my favorite texts of Tolkien, which is the short story Live by Nigel. That's the description of the tree. I'm sure you're very familiar with this text, but I will read it again because I think there is a very beautiful rendition of this paradox of collaboration and idiosyncrasy, if you want. And I read very briefly from the description of Nigel's tree in Nigel's parish. And Nigel went on looking at the tree. All the leaves he had ever labored at were there as he had imagined them rather than as he had made them. And there were others that are only budding in his mind. And many they might have budded if only he had had the time. Here's the key passage. Some of the most beautiful and the most characteristic, so the most idiosyncratic, if you want, the most, and I quote, perfect examples of the Nigel style, so they were in a way more typical, more characteristic of Nigel, were seen to have been produced in collaboration with Mr. Parish. There was no other way of putting it. I really like this passage because you see really the paradox. Nigel's typical style, which at the same time was the one which had clearly been produced in collaboration with Mr. Parish. We find, of course, the same collaborative dimension also in Tolkien's higher mythology. I could go on forever, but I think it's enough to quote, to refer to the Lindale, which is, of course, a collaborative genesis, as I think John Garth has defined it. And it's a genesis which features the collaboration between different sub-creators, but also between a creator and sub-creator. So we may say that from the very beginning of the artistic analogy in Tolkien, we find this collaborative dimension. And also in his life, Tolkien, of course, lived and conceived his work in a broad sense as a collaborative enterprise. And perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this is his own relationship with his son Christopher, which in a sense, without the collaboration between those two, we would not have the Silmarillion and everything that came after, but in a certain sense, we would not have had the Hobbit, and we would not have had even the Lord of the Rings, knowing that Tolkien wrote both of these texts, having in mind his children, and especially in the second case, Christopher also did actual work, as you know, in the editing of the work. And I also think it's important to mention that the very fact, which again, from a literary critic like myself, is quite intriguing, the very fact that Tolkien accepted and wanted to entrust his magnum opus to his son, in a sense, it was an act of detachment, of authority detachment, which is quite impressive. Okay, I don't think there are many parallels in the history of Western literature of this kind of desire and availability to be engaged in a collaborative work. And I think that in the Lord of the Rings, we have this beautiful moment when Bilbo passes on his notes to Frodo, in a sense that's either symbolic, prophetic, or however you want to call it, or something which goes to the very depth of Tolkien's creative enterprise. Among other important collaborations in Tolkien's life, of course, I could quote C.S. Lewis, but I do think that he's just one of many. Also, from at the professional level, Tolkien was a keen collaborator. I was talking to Oronzo just yesterday, and he was reminding me how often Tolkien co-wrote some of the dissertations of his students, and we have plenty of evidence that many passages from the student dissertations were heavily edited, if not even written by Tolkien, but never actually claimed ownership, if you want. Again, if you're in academia nowadays, you will see that's not so common either. Today, we are going to talk about, in the next couple of days, about a collaboration, a creative collaboration, one of the earliest collaborations in Tolkien's life, and in a sense, one of the most important. Of course, this collaboration is the one with G.B. Smith, an alumnus of this very college, Corpus Christi. Very pleased that we have an event in this college dedicated to Smith, also for this affiliation. Smith was, of course, a member of the Immortal Four, as they were called, and especially during his university here in Oxford, he was certainly one of the four that was most closest to Tolkien. Smith's influence on Tolkien, I think, it's difficult to deny, especially at the early stage, and just to will quote Smith himself talking about this in a quote which I find very beautiful, which is reported in John's book. We believe in your work, we others, and recognize with pleasure our own finger in it. Very beautiful image of this collaborative dimension of Tolkien's work from the very beginning. One of the main purposes of this conference is to investigate and delve further into this into the truth of the work which I just read. In what sense we can recognize the pleasure of the finger in Tolkien's early work, but the same would be the same for the other way around. In what sense we can find Tolkien's finger in Smith's work. I also hope that this will be a conference, will be an occasion to give justice to a sense to G.B. Smith, whose life and poetry remained only a spring harvest in the end. We don't know what he would have become. He was one of the many victims of the First World War, but he was one of the very many victims of history. We only saw the very, very beginning, and yet, we also know that Smith's desires and aspirations did not die out, did not completely die in the blood of the Somme, but they were carried forward through the meaningful friendship of JRRT, and eventually, I strongly believe, found completion, fulfillment in Tolkien's own work. I think I've spoken enough. There was just need to make a short introduction, but I will conclude with a final quote, which for me is also very, very dear, which is, if you want, the last words of Smith to Tolkien, and the words through which Smith entrusts truly his artistic aspiration to his friend. And may God bless you, dear John Ronald, and may you say things I've tried to say long after I'm not there to say them. The fact that we are here today, in a sense, is to witness that this will actually happen in a way. And so we are here not just to hear the things that Tolkien tried to say, but also the things that Smith tried to say and eventually were said by Tolkien. I think we're ready to start. Just a couple of quick notices. As I was mentioning before, the loo is upstairs on the right if you need to go. We are going to have a session from now until 4:45. We're going to have two speakers that will now soon call to come here to the lectern. We'll have half an hour by John Garth, first of all, half an hour by Khuri, and then another half an hour of discussion. Okay. Then we'll have a bit of a pause with tea and coffee, another session in the afternoon, at this point only with the Ronzo Chilli. We'll conclude a bit earlier than we originally hoped. And then we're going to reconvene for drinks and dinner at 6:45, but I will come back on this later on. At this point, I will ask John to come here. I will give a very short introduction to John. I don't think John actually needs a long introduction. I think everyone knows who John Gaff is. John is certainly one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent Tolkien scholar of our generation. He's the author of several important books, including one which is, of course, at the core of this conference, Tolkien's Great War, which is Tolkien the Great War, which was edited twice. I could go on and list John's publication, or we don't have a lot of time. I will just mention one of the most recent, that is to say, The Wars of J.R.R. Tolkien, the beautiful volume in several languages, which was published, I think, 2 years ago now, 2021. 2020, it's already 3 years. Time flies. It was just the beginning of COVID. I got my one copy. We're very glad that John is here with us. In a sense, John is at the core of the inspiration of this conference. The title of the conference itself comes from, indeed, from his own book, A Meaningful Friendship. So thank you very much, John, for being with us, for having the generosity to introduce our conference. John will talk about a perfect genius, G.B. Smith among family and friends. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Giuseppe, and Doug Anderson, if you're watching. Are we on camera somewhere?
Yeah.
And Alonso, too, for organising this and inviting me. I, too, wanted to come to Oxford and teach philology, but I wasn't clever enough. So instead I became a journalist and ended up getting that out of my system, because that's not what I wanted anyway, and writing about Tolkien. But the effect that Tolkien had on me, I was thinking about this as I was driving up today, as a 9-year-old when I was reading Lord of the Rings. I was listening to it in the car today. It was rather like I was a sort of Frankenstein's monster of bits and bobs from different relatives without much of a me there. And the Lord of the Rings came along and vivified me, made me find my path forward. And the reason I mention this is because I think you could say that Smith did that with Tolkien. So I want to give you today a sense of who Smith was, some of his background, which isn't known generally or at all, maybe. I've dug around in his family history a bit. I'm not going to repeat what's already written in Tolkien and the Great War, because I couldn't do it any better than that, and it's there, it's available, and I don't have that much time. And there's also another very relevant piece that I've written called Robert Quilter Gilson, TCBS, A Brief Life in Letters, which was published in Tolkien Studies. I don't remember what issue or what year, I'm afraid, off the top of my head, but it's a load of quotes, passages from Gilson's letters, some of which talk about G.B. Smith in really vivid detail. If I get time, I will quote some of that, but there's more in that paper. So the first thing to know about Smith is that he was from Mordor, the Black Country of Staffordshire, the area of heavy industry that grew up in the 18th and especially 19th centuries, so that it was a very dark landscape, very polluted, full of factories and housing built for factory workers. He was from a town called West Bromwich, and this is a little passage from a directory of 1912, when Smith was still living there, describing West Bromwich. The town is celebrated for its metal industries. The articles manufactured here, all of which are made on an extensive scale, include axle bolts and hollow shafts, fenders, fire irons, locks, bolts, hinges, nails, saddler's ironmongery, coach furniture, spring balances and steam gauges, springs, iron culinary utensils, chains, traces, spades and other implements of husbandry, steel toys, saucepan handles, railway pins, hollow ware, scale beams, etc., etc. Among the larger works are furnaces for the smelting of iron ore, foundries, forges and slitting mills. There are also maltings, brass foundries, boatyards, lime kilns, tar distilleries, washing and baking powder manufactories, brickyards, etc. There's also a colliery, a coal mine. So that gives you a very vivid picture of somewhere that's not very green. The family was connected to the Salter family that had founded a company called Salters that made springs, especially scales for weighing things on. As time went by, it passed to the Bache family, which is where Geoffrey Bache Smith gets his middle name. And during the First World War, as many factories had to do, the Salters plant switched over to making springs for field guns, rifles, fuses for shells and hand grenades, machine gun parts for Vickers guns, Lewis guns, and anti-aircraft guns. So into this, G.B. Smith was born on the 18th of October 1894 at home at number 31, the High Street. Now, the High Street was right in the heart of town, and Salter's factory was also on the High Street. So it wasn't a clean, airy space. And that's the Black Country skyline, painted by a man who's known as the poet and artist of the Black Country, Edwin Butler Bayliss, probably around the time that we're talking about. A little later, by 1911, so by Smith's late teens, they had moved down the High Street to the other end, to the edge of West Bromwich, where it was clearly green. So Grove Crescent, I managed to find a postcard of Grove Crescent itself. Pleasant enough place, and just down the road from there, at this right-hand end of the image, you will see a football ground, which is the Hawthorns, the home ground of West Bromwich Albion. Now, I won't pretend that I'm a football fan, but this is relevant because of connections between the Smith family and football. So, Smith's father's name was Thomas Bache Smith. He was a commercial clerk, a cashier and buyer at Salter's Works in West Bromwich. So that means he was an educated white-collar worker and part of that extended family that ran the factory. He played football in the Works team, which went on to become West Bromwich Albion, leading football team. And he died at home in January 1911, presumably quite a cold winter. He was age 59, and he went to see his team play at the Hawthorns, and he caught a chill, and he died the same night. Now, there's one seemingly not very striking poem in A Spring Harvest, G.B. Smith's collected verse. It was all in the Black Country, what time the sweeter year should be. I saw a tree all gaunt and grey, as mindful of a winter's day, and that a lonely bird did sit upon the topmost branch of it, who to my thought did sweeter sing than any minstrel of a king. And as I was researching this talk, I realised that the West Bromwich Albion badge, emblem, logo is a bird sitting on a branch of a tree singing. So I presume that here, buried in Smith's apparently trivial little poem, is a tribute to his hometown, his home team, and perhaps his father too. If you look on Wikipedia, I had a moment of excitement when I saw that Tom Smith came up with the idea of this image, but it turns out there are multiple Tom Smiths there at the Salters factory and on the team, and it wasn't this particular Thomas Bache Smith. So there is a part of Smith's family tree. the reason I've researched this, and the whole thing is much broader, is because as a researcher, I've always wanted to trace anyone who might have inherited Smith's papers. And it proved, you know, with a surname like Smith, that's very difficult. It's an extremely common surname in Britain. But the key in the end was the name Bache, because that's a rarity. And I discovered that there was a book by someone called Mary Bache about Salter's factory. And in there's a Bache family tree, and I managed to add to that and research some more. So we'll also see the family of Smith's mother, Ruth Annie Smith, born as Ruth Annie Peacock. And the illustrations on the right there are by Ruth's sister, Mildred, who was a minor arts and crafts artist when the arts and crafts movement, popularised by William Morris, that great man in the 19th century, was in its heyday. And when the Birmingham School of Art, where she studied, was, you know, a real centre of the arts and crafts movement. So there was some, you know, artistic influence within Smith's family, some sense of looking beyond the practicalities of day-to-day work and looking even beyond football to higher matters, if I dare say that about football. Early in 1904, Smith started as a student, as a schoolboy at King Edward's School, which is where he met the other friends who became the TCDS. Very early in 1911, so this is bearing in mind his father died in January, Smith wins the Governor's Prize for English Verse and the Old Edwardians Association Prize for Recitation of English Poetry. He's only second in that prize category after Christopher Wiseman. And it's in 1911, so again after his father has died, that Smith starts to make an appearance in the school records, in the school activities as recorded in the school newspaper, the Chronicle. He appears in lots of debates and makes talks and comments in the Literary Society. So his maiden speech, an excellent maiden speech it was described as, was, "This House demands immediate war with Germany," and he spoke against that motion. This is 3 years before the First World War broke out, but Germany had done something that, you know, set everyone else on edge. And Smith insisted that there was no cause for alarm except for the Daily Mail and the Kaiser's whiskers, these scary mustachios that the German leader wore. Smith had, he loved debating. He admired the leading debating figure of the age, in particular because he had the same initials as him, George Bernard Shaw. And in one of the school's Latin debates, Smith went under the name Caius Bernardus Shavius. Notes on his debating style: he spoke frequently. He cannot be induced under any circumstances to make a serious speech, but regales the House with tempestuous orations bubbling over with Bernard Shaw and G.K. Chesterton. He became the Debating Society secretary in October 1912 and ran an exceptionally brilliant programme, which was exceptionally under-attended. And I discovered recently, if you looked at my blog, an anonymous piece by Smith as the Debating Society secretary, where he rather marvellously imagines himself having dreams, anxiety dreams about what he's going to devise for this debating programme to get people coming along to it. And he has, he has talked with various famous people from history there. It's a bit like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Smith's literary leanings can be seen coming through even when he was at school. So he's now 17, my maths. And he gives a talk to the Literary Society about early English ballads, in which he argues for, he talks about these medieval ballads, and he argues that they are not authored by a single person. They are products of oral transmission, which was, I think, a relatively new way of looking at medieval and more ancient poetry like Homer. And he talks about how they evolved from being tunes to dance to into short narratives. And then with the help of some epic tendency, they became small-scale stories themselves. He admired their simplicity, and he contrasted the 18th century elaboration of style and language that had come into English poetry. And, you know, the 18th century at this stage was still quite recent. Poets such as Alexander Pope. And he explained the service which the 19th century, by its interest in folklore, had performed for the student of literature. The ballads must appeal to us as a literary expression of England and her people, of all that we know and love in the English landscape and character. And I think here you can see that Smith is hitting on really key points that Tolkien began his mythology from. The importance of folklore studies, tied in with philology, of course, in the 19th century. Inseparable from philology, in fact. The idea of writing in a simple way that communicates, but bringing to it an epic tendency. And the idea of somehow imbuing your writings with this love of your homeland. Smith's first published poem seems to have been Wind from the Sea in the School Chronicle in 1912. It's a poem, as far as I understand it. I'm sure someone else here will explain it better, probably. It appears to be reflections on the cusp of adulthood. A sense that you know, life could fleet by and leave you unfulfilled, but there are driving forces of history, and if you can ride with them, maybe you can make something of your life. The language and imagery of that poem are very, very W.B. Yeats of his Celtic Twilight period. I mean, he was enormously influential, and I think it's probably quite hard to find many people with any taste for kind of Celtic lore who were not under Yeats's shadow at that time. One of his obituarists and friends, A.D. Burnett Brown, wrote in the Pelican Record, the journal of Corpus Christi College, the influence of Yeats, one of his favourite writers, is very clearly marked, talking about the whole of A Spring Harvest, and there is more than a tinge in the book of Celtic melancholy. And then in January 1913, Smith spoke to the school literary society about Arthurian literature. His paper was described as one of the most interesting we have listened to, and one which introduced a more or less uninitiated house to a most fascinating body of literature. And he began with the epic story of Culhwch and Olwen, a hero from Arthur's court who wants to marry a giant's daughter in the Mabinogion. He calls it the greatest epic in, greatest epoch, that era, the Mabinogion era, in Arthurian literature. He talks about the possibility that there was a real Arthur at some point. And he traced the stories of Arthur from its semi-historical stage to the stage of pure legend. And I think Tolkien here. I think about Tolkien imagining you know, the true stories that became the fragmented legends that we have inherited. So when Smith talks about, you know, recognizing our finger in your work, John Ronald, I think that, you know, this may well have been one aspect where Smith either brought the goods to Tolkien and showed them, or at the very least was you know, an informed interlocutor, someone who could discuss these things in a really interested and passionate way, to help Tolkien, you know, find his own route through it. And in March 1913, so when he was still at school, he published a poem called "To the Ancient Heroes of the Cymry," the Welsh, which appears under a different title in the Spring Harvest, "Dark is the World Our Fathers Left Us." He published it under his own name in a journal called Wales, a national magazine. So you can see his urgent drive and ambition there, I think. And then he came here. He applied to Oxford in late 1912. Christopher Wiseman said to Tolkien, "I envy you, Smith, for though we have Barraclough and Peyton, he is the pick of the bunch." And he got a £50 scholarship to come here. Matriculated October 1913. And Tolkien wrote of Smith's rooms, "His tendency, self-confessed, to aesthetic intellectualism is outraging itself in a strange, if incomplete, scheme of decoration." He went on walks, and his friend Burnet Brown remembers on more than one occasion being hard put to it to keep up with Smith's rapid stride. He spoke on the Faust legends to the college's Sundial Society, and it set off for some reason or other with Welsh and Arthurian romances. At that point, his friend Rob Gilson came from Cambridge with another friend and a member of the TCDS at this time, T.K. Barnsley, or Tea-Cake. And Gilson wrote, "We had such a splendid weekend, full marks, as Tea-Cake would say, for everything but weather. I saw lots of Scopes," another friend, "and Tolkien, and G.B. Smith, all of whom seemed very contented with life, though G.B. Smith was seedy on Saturday." I think he means ill. TK and I dined in hall at Corpus on Sunday, and afterwards Scopes took me to a meeting at which GBS read a paper on the Faust legend. And I joined in the subsequent discussion, much to my own enjoyment, if to no one else's. And Smith went on speaking in college debates, and in November 1914, he went and visited Cambridge in his term. Tolkien was supposed to go, didn't turn up. Gilson wrote, "But Smith has actually come and we're having a great weekend. It's most refreshing to hear his comments on Cambridge and things in general. I wish you could see him sometime when he is not awed into his drawing room manner. It's a real pleasure to sit and hear him talk when he's in good form. He really is a bit of a genius and has a gift for rapping out preposterous paradoxes that always delight me with their neatness and often with their absurdity. And I always value his judgment, though I often disagree with it." The same month, he gave a Sundial paper on the 18th century, its literature, manner, and ideas. So I think Smith seems to be moving now into a new interest, the 18th century, which previously he had placed against, you know, the ballads and their simplicity. And presumably at Smith's invitation, the same month, Tolkien gave a talk here about the Kalevala, the Finnish national epic. December, the following month, Gilson writes to his stepmother saying, "G.B. Smith told me a few days ago that he was applying for a commission. A rumour says that he has now got one in the Oxford and Bucks, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. I've just read his poem in the Oxford magazine, Ave Atque Vale, addressed to Oxford. Farewell." And that same month, Smith, Gilson, Wiseman, and Tolkien all convened at Wiseman's parents' house in London for what they call the Council of London, which is the event that Tolkien said set off the rocket for him, set him off with his own ambitions to become a poet and to create a mythology. So I must thank someone out there on the internet for putting together this this foursome of the TCBS, which is beyond my skill with Photoshop. I can't credit you because I didn't see anyone to credit. That photo top left is from Lancashire Fusiliers publication, and maybe the only other photograph we have of Smith. See, we're knocking on, but Giuseppe, can I roll a bit? Because we've got a little. Do you want to continue for 5 minutes? Yeah, that would be great. Yeah. I'm thinking if Alonso isn't speaking that. Well, later, okay. After the break, so the is speaking about the he is. Fine. Okay. All right. So he then moved on in April 1915 to join the Lancashire Fusiliers, and that's why Tolkien joined that regiment too, though they didn't end up in the same battalions. Wiseman wrote that July, G.B. Smith, in nearly every letter I get from GBS, he says he is growing up. I don't know whether it's only the additional weight of his moustache, but I presume there must be something in it. So army officers had to grow moustaches. And he was training on Salisbury Plain near Gilson. They went up onto the plain one day and sat there. These are Gilson's words: sat down with a wonderful view all around us, greys and dull blues and greens, with wet trees down in the valley all blurred and misty. I drew a little picture of a copse. G.B. Smith wrote a poem about it some time ago, Song on the Downs. The one thing I believe of his, which is being printed in Oxford Poetry 1915. So I gave him the drawing. He read Herrick to me, 17th century poet, while I drew, and we got miles away from the war. It is so splendid to feel that we can go on meeting every weekend while we're both here. And then another letter, it makes a real difference having GBS in the neighbourhood. And Gilson talks about how they've all sat there talking with GBS's commanding officer about Rupert Brooke and Yeats and Keats and Milton, Tintoretto, Perugino. Smith and Gilson went to Bath together. It's been a really pleasant weekend, and we have immersed ourselves in an 18th century atmosphere and conducted most of our conversation in Johnsonian and Gibbonian periods, in other words, in the style of Samuel Johnson and Gibbon, the author of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. G.B. Smith composes excellent Gibbon. He is at present reading Amelia and reveling in it. I very quickly catch his enthusiasm for that extraordinary century. Oops, leaping ahead there. And again, sorry. So once in France, so Smith went over to France, I think in December 1915. Gilson writes, everyone else I know has read a dozen books at least. G.B. Smith has read a huge amount since he's been out here, but I never could keep pace with him. He read voraciously and to my despair when we were at school. And his last mention of Smith is, I fancy G.B. Smith is not far from here. I wish I could find him. That's in May. And on the 1st of July, Gilson was killed on the opening day of the Battle of the Somme. Smith lasted through that awful 4-month battle until a day in December of 1916, when he was 4 miles behind the front line arranging a football match for his men. I'm reminded of his father. And a stray shell exploded nearby, and a little fragment caught him in the thigh or buttock. And he walked to the dressing station to have his wound dressed, and then he caught something called gas gangrene, and it finished him off in a couple of days. So there's his gravestone. He's buried at Valancourt Alt British Cemetery. And there you see an old photograph of the corridor at King Edward's School. This is black and white one in the middle. That ran between the library where the TCBS was founded and Big School, which is the name of the largest classroom. And that is the only surviving part of this great Gothic building that was demolished around 1930. It survives because it was moved to the site of the new school in Edgbaston and set up as the chapel there, and that's the chapel now. So inside it, you can still see those elegant traceried ceilings and all the carved walls, but on the walls are now the plates that show the names of all the soldiers who died in the First World War, and there is Geoffrey Bache Smith's name and his brother Roger Smith, I think, that is down at the bottom there. So Roger Smith died 1 month later. I found the letter. So we know that you know, from Humphrey Carpenter's biography, that Tolkien heard about Smith's death from Christopher Wiseman. I've now found how Christopher Wiseman learned. It was in a letter from his father, Frederick Luke Wiseman. My dear Chris, on returning home a few minutes ago, I found among my letters a newspaper from West Bromwich. It contains the very sad news that your chum GBS succumbed to shell wounds on December the 3rd. I am truly distressed at this news, not indeed for him or his fate, but for you, who I know loved him so deeply. And I can hardly write to see for the mist which will cover my eyes as I think of your grief when you read what I have to tell you. Somehow God is in it, at any rate over it. A better death Smith could not die. Think of him as promoted to a higher sphere for larger opportunity for the gifts of which you thought so highly. I shall the more earnestly pray for you that you may have grace to bear this trouble with fortitude and trustfulness. And then in January, Wiseman really struggled to write to Tolkien. He says, you know, I have binned letter after letter that I've started. And weeks passed before he could bring himself to write. And when he did, he said, the whole thing is so ineffably mysterious. To have seen two of God's giants, Smith and Gilson, pass before our eyes, to have lived and laughed with them, and to have learnt of them, and to have found them something like ourselves, and to see them go back into the mist whence they came out. My dear John Ronald, I don't know what to make of it. Do you? And then another discovery, a letter from Smith's mother Ruth to Christopher Wiseman, unpublished. I was delighted to have a letter from you, and I'm glad you like the book, The Spring Harvest. Another friend I sent the book to said directly he looked into it, he was reminded at once of Geoffrey. It is, as you say, just himself. Of course, I think he stood alone. I never knew anyone who so enjoyed the present moment as he did. He had never been away from me for any length of time until going to Oxford, and you know what a companion he was. I saw so little of him after joining the army, but each time we met, he was, if possible, dearer, and his frequent letters seemed part of my life. He grew so thoughtful, I cannot help thinking he had an idea that his life would be a short one. After the death of RQG, he wrote, life will not be worth living without one's friends. And he told me how he found his lonely grave. I like your idea of a song cycle and hope you will succeed in carrying it out. So my last point here is the question, what would Smith have been if he had survived? I mean, we can see that perhaps, in the words of Frederick Luke Wiseman, in a sense, even if you're an atheist, as I am, you know, he was promoted to a higher sphere where his work could continue to be done, because I think his death probably helped to motivate Tolkien, particularly in times of doubt, you know, when he wasn't confident of completing his own creative work. So in Smith's Daily Telegraph obituary, It says, it was intended that he should enter the Home Civil Service, which would have given him the opportunity of also pursuing a literary career for which he possessed both inclination and talent. And in an unsigned personal memoir by a friend in the Oxford magazine, he always hoped to return to Oxford and throw himself into advanced historical work. His undergraduate degree that he began was in history. What his technical qualifications for this were, I do not know, but he would not have failed for lack of a large-hearted enthusiasm. And then in a little book called For Remembrance, Soldier Poets Who Have Fallen in the War by Arthur St. John Adcock, he was looking forward to devoting himself to literature as a profession when the war, at a stroke, shattered all his plans. So the only thing I have left, I won't trouble you with, but maybe there'll be an opportunity at some other point, which is a cautionary tale about identification. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much for this great introduction to the character of Jimmy Smith. I think that was fantastic. I have already a couple of questions, but I will leave them for the second part, the final part of our session today. Before then, I'll invite Grace Khuri to come here on the stage. We'll just briefly introduce her. Grace is a DPhil student, a PhD student at the University of Oxford. I believe she was with Mark Atherton and Andy Orchard, and Mark Atherton and Andy Orchard. She works at the Faculty of English. Maybe she will talk a bit about her research interest today. Basically, she works especially on the influence of Nordic mythology and more broadly of early medieval mythology in the cultural discourse of the First World War. There will be, it's quite, my paper and also the paper of another of our speakers will be somehow dedicated to reconstruct the cultural milieu of the early 20th century and how different cultural influences were kind of molding the perception, the cultural mindset of the people in Britain. Okay, and she's writing a PhD on this very topic, but maybe she will say something more on that during the presentation. She's already a good publication record. She has done a fantastic podcast on the Silmarillion, which I strongly recommend. You can find it on her personal page. You can find a link on the personal page. And today, let me just put on her presentation before I leave you the stage. And I think it's in here. Sorry, guys. Okay, very good. So today, guys, we'll talk about Geoffrey G.B. Smith at Oxford and at war. Thank you very much. I leave you put your laptop here, and the charger is over there.
Thank you, Bache. Well, thank you everyone for being here. I'm sorry to say that I'm not specifically talking about my research as a part of this paper. However, I am happy to answer any questions. Can you hear me all right?
The other one.
Oh, the other one. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm happy to answer any questions about my research outside of this talk. But today I'm focusing on Geoffrey Bache Smith and some sources that I found about him here at Oxford, specifically at the Oxford Union. Geoffrey Bache Smith was a person of intriguing contrasts. A vivacious public persona exhibited in school debates coexisted with a deeply reflective, even metaphysically inclined inner life, revealed in his occasionally quasi-mystical verse, enriched by a love of myth, legend, and music, which became essential consolations in wartime. Smith's personality and tastes, recorded in the letters of his closest friends from the TCBS, or Tea Club and Barovian Society, Robert Gilson, Christopher Wiseman, and J.R.R. Tolkien, have been discussed at length, along with other related materials, in John Garth's Tolkien and the Great War, and subsequent articles and online publications by the same author. Issues of the King Edward School Chronicle, reminiscing reviews of his posthumously published poetry anthology, A Spring Harvest, and of course, Smith's own writings, both poems and letters, also offer their glimpses of an all too brief life. More recent discoveries shed further light on Smith's activities in and responses to a pre-war and war-era world. Today I will be presenting some materials I discovered during my DPhil research on the Edwardian and First World War historical backdrop of Tolkien's mythology, materials which help expand our understanding of the poignant dichotomy of G.B. Smith. While perusing the hefty volumes of early 20th century issues of the Oxford University magazine, established in 1883, I came across a delightful surprise. Evidence that J.R.R. Tolkien's close friend, fellow King Edward School alumnus and Oxford undergraduate G.B. Smith, had spoken to the Oxford Union numerous times. Further evidence was supplied in issues of the two competing student periodicals of the time, the Isis and the Varsity, featuring reports on the weekly Union debates and offering an invaluable window into the lost world of Edwardian-era Oxford, right before the outbreak of the First World War. These three magazines compensate for the paucity of detail in the yearly issues of the Proceedings of the Oxford Union Society, which only provided the most remedial information about each debate, the names of society officers, the motion, lists of speakers in the affirmative and in the negative, and the final tally of votes. By contrast, the student reporters for the Isis and the Varsity possessed dramatist sensibilities, recounting scenes from Union meetings with witty loquacity and sometimes quite acerbic frankness. There is an unexpected poignancy in reading these accounts of young men who went on to serve and perish in the ensuing conflict of 1914 to 18, only a small number of whom are commemorated on a plaque in the Oxford Union Debating Hall. The rest, like G.B. Smith, are remembered on the walls of chapels or other commemorative spaces in their respective colleges. My aim is to bring some of these lost voices back to life again, while also revealing how Smith was received by his peers in pre-war Oxford, who assembled to debate domestic and foreign affairs at the Oxford Union, founded in 1823 and celebrating its bicentenary this year. Smith's frequent participation in these debates demonstrates his continuing interest in public affairs and disputation, following his time as secretary of King Edward School Debating Society. The Oxford Union, or Oxford Union Society, with its weekly debates during term time, usually on Thursdays, was a staple of university life, and the Edwardian period was a golden age of wit and discourse in an academic theatre half humorously viewed as a microcosm of the House of Commons. After several decades of what is now the old library serving as the debating chamber, a steepled brick building, that's not the steepled brick building, but anyway, imagine a steepled brick building with a wood-paneled interior adorned with august portraits of former members became the new venue. Attendees were seated on the main floor or in the gallery, the latter a perilously precarious and tight space when overcrowded. Speakers would walk up to a dispatch box where they would deliver their remarks. Debates would usually begin around 8:30 p.m. and last until well past 10. If a debate ran very late, attendees risked not being able to get back into their colleges, which locked at midnight. Although there is no evidence that Tolkien, who came up to Oxford to Exeter in 1911, spoke at any union debates, despite having a union membership and paying termly fees, he likely discussed some of the motions which tackled key issues of the day with Smith, who was at Corpus Christi from autumn 1913. Since union events were a macrocosm of similar activities in his own college's societies, Tolkien likely read about these in the Isis or Varsity, Periodicals were widely read by students during that period. Due to the vagaries of time, certain volumes and even some of the history of Edwardian era periodicals have been lost. Thankfully, not so with the Isis. A weekly paper founded in 1892, originally owned and published by Halliwell Press, was always edited by students. Its first editor, the impeccably named Mostyn Turtle Pigott, defined the periodical's purpose thus: "We have no politics, and fewer principles. Should we last until the general election, we shall use our influence for neither side. We shall endeavor to be humorous without being ill-humored, critical without being captious, militant without being malevolent, and independent without being impertinent, and funny, as Mr. Chevalier says, without being vulgar." Elsewhere, historians have described the Isis as a painstaking recorder of university minutiae, and all the more welcome for its tongue in its cheek, containing within its 8 pages assiduous reports of Oxford Union debates, rugby matches, and university theatre, laced with ribbing asides and jocular verse. In the 1910s, the period G.B. Smith was at Oxford, the magazine was still very much living up to its originally stated principles. The greatest driver of the paper's sales were its reports of the Oxford Union proceedings, which do not disappoint in their colorful representations of the intellectual conquests, dashing wit, and quirky oratorical antics of Oxford undergraduates. There were protestations about the dreariness of some of the meetings. One anonymous commentator simultaneously objects to and agrees with the paper's editor on the point, admitting that the Union debates are dull. The Union contains undergraduates, some of whom will certainly one day be orators, and a few of whom are already interesting speakers. But no debater can ever possess half the knowledge or politics or the experience of oratory which manages to conceal itself in the Commons. Recollections of Smith's energetic participation grace the twilight of the magazine's pre-war issue, which ceased publication for 4 years during the First World War, returning in 1919. The liveliness, or lack thereof, of the Union debates was commemorated with great panache by the editors of the Isis and its younger competitor, the Varsity, established in 1901, and with a little more restraint by those of the Oxford Magazine, also produced on a weekly basis during term time. Those reporting on the Union speeches were by turns bemused by and complimentary of Smith's speeches. University and student periodicals published brief accounts, more or less memorable speakers, usually as short summaries of what the magazine reporter thought were the most relevant or interesting details of responses to emotion, the topic for debate. Occasionally, direct quotes were provided. Many recorders indulged in quite wry commentary. Their accounts reveal how Union debates, events intended to be the height of intellectual discourse and argument, occasionally devolved into inanity and even unintelligibility. Personalities and presentation styles varied widely. A certain A.F.H. Wigan of Oriel was described as far too quiet and philosophical ever to hold the attention of the House. Mr. H.G. Strauss of Christ Church was the exponent of the sincerest form of affectation. Meanwhile, humorists of varying levels of success were also well represented. From E.H. Davenport, Queens, noted as a delightful humorist in style and standpoint, to P.C. Chevalier, Jesus, a more or less successful buffoon. These are complemented by a serio-comic and a so-called flippant debater. That's the Oxford Union. G.B. Smith, who already had substantial experience speaking at the debating society at King Edward's School, along with his friends Gilson, Wiseman, and Tolkien in Birmingham, was keen to continue his experience at Oxford. His sharp intellect, powers of dramatic assertion, and an eloquence at times hampered by his somewhat eccentric personality, were both a unique and typical contribution to union debates, where a variety of mannerisms and delivery styles were displayed. The first recorded instance of Smith's participation was in what was then called Lent Term 1914. He had started his degree in the autumn. Accounts of his maiden speech, delivered January 28th, were predominantly positive, reporting on Smith's response to the motion that this House would welcome some scheme of imperial federation. The Oxford Magazine states, "Mr. G.B. Smith, Corpus Christi, was distinctly good, and we hope will be heard earlier another time." The ISIS provided a little more detail. Mr. G.B. Smith, CCC, was sarcastic and emphatic, and better than most. However, his next exhibition a few weeks later was received with far less appreciation in response to the motion that this House expresses its confidence in the constructive policy of His Majesty's opposition. Mr. Smith spoke, as he himself admitted, with all the flatness with which he was capable. The ISIS dryly notes concerning Smith's soporific performance, following up with the more general didactic warning that those who stay until 11:30 just to listen to the speeches are not so vigorous as those who are waiting to fire off sheets of oratory, and they do want something more lively than this. Other issues of the periodical had reported members falling asleep in the latter portion of long debates, apparently victims of sitting for 3 hours under more or less engaging speeches. The varsity, however, was slightly more forgiving. Mr. Smith was not very exciting, but the House was really curiously depressing. In the following spring term, Smith's ebullience sprung to new heights. For the term's first meeting on April 30th, the ISIS correspondent, in the manner of Toby MP from Punch, made a hilarious foray into interpreting and recreating the dizzying proceedings that followed the motion censuring the government's mismanagement of the Irish crisis. Smith's appearance was recreated in more elaborate detail than usual. GBS, Smith, not Shaw, moved partly by last speech and partly by intolerable drought, penetrating through the swing doors marked eyes and nose, left teller's seat and gave air of importance to debate by appearing at dispatch box in gents' correct evening wear. Imitation of curate being examined in elocution rather overdone, but error in the right direction. In a May 7 meeting, apparently devoting a second week to the same topic it seems, the Oxford Magazine picked out Smith as one of 2 speakers credited with retaining the attention of a fast-dwindling House, with the varsity favorably comparing him to a recent ex-president at Lincoln, which should be taken as a compliment. For this same evening, the ISIS reveals a wider atmosphere of theatricality, marked by some comic oratorical chaos, with its usual column on the Oxford Union, somewhat cheekily renamed Essence of the Union Debate. One of the speakers, Galans, apparently infuriated the House with fresh outrage by splitting an infinitive. To make matters worse, noisy expostulators, when requested to address the House, failed to produce a single grammatical sentence. Naturally, such an environment only added fuel to the flame for the incessantly vivacious Smith, who apparently could not contain himself after hearing some expostulations of one the ISIS reporter had dubbed Harwood the Hasty, elsewhere identified as Mr. H.E. Harwood of Balliol, and incidentally that autumn Harwood would later open the discussion as a visitor at the Sundial Society meeting held in Smith's rooms at Corpus, where Smith gave the paper. Smith, after giving Harwood a charming compliment, proceeded with what was described as a rather over-elaborated speech, which asked the question, it seems using his exact words, "What can I do in the face of so much wit and so much beauty?" In this same issue of this magazine printed one of Smith's poems, surprisingly without his name or even initials, The House of Eld. testimony to a very different side of his personality, with a later reviewer noting its eerie quality, characteristic of the Celtic literature he loved. Now the old winds are wild about the house, and old ghosts cry to me from the air of a far isle set in the western sea, and of the evening sunlight lingering there. These surprisingly quasi-Tolkienian lines, with their sea-longing and desire for a wondrous isle, anticipate key elements of his friend's mythology. The poem stands as an intriguing counterpoint to Smith's reported antics in the recent Oxford Union debate, and the two aptly illustrate the contending tides of his persona, like two seasons coexisting in one place simultaneously. Smith's last lightheartedly exuberant speeches were in spring 1914, well before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the ominous throes of the July crisis. By this time, attention was being drawn to conflicts further afield, including the Ulster crisis and labor strikes in South Africa in 1913 and 14. A strike in January 1914 and the subsequent deportation of 9 mine workers became a subject of controversy, one picked up by a spring debate condemning Prime Minister Louis Botha, a former general in the Boer War. The debate, and Smith's participation in it, was significant enough to warrant a brief mention in the May 8th issue of the widely read local newspaper, the Oxford Chronicle. The Oxford Magazine's analysis of Smith's response in opposition to the motion, "This House deplores the policy initiated by General Botha with regard to the South African labor troubles," expressed respect for the content of his speech, noting how Smith wanted to offer ungarnished facts and did so effectively, while also complaining about his personality. His voice and manner have the merits and demerits of an acquired taste, before admitting, despite apparent prejudice, at any rate, they are exceptional. The Varsity, also appreciating Smith's studiousness on the topic, share its rival paper's views on his persona. Mr. G.B. Smith was very carefully prepared in both substance and delivery. He claimed that General Botha's policy was justified by success, and seemed to be well up in the South African labor papers of the moment. Mr. Smith had an original personality, but must be careful not to overdo it. What was it about Smith's personality that seemed so out of step with the personas of his peers accused in one issue of the ISIS of being too carefully and so obviously prepared, and afflicted with a lamentable lack of spontaneity? Some explanation is provided in a spring issue of the King Edward School Chronicle back in 1912. In one of his many responses recorded in the Debating Society Minutes, one gives this assessment, courtesy of the Society's then secretary, fellow TCBSite Robert Gilson. G.B. Smith made an amusing speech, which perhaps appealed more to those who are familiar with his humor than to the audience as a whole. Gilson's characterization of his friend's charming eccentricities may account for some of the less enthused reactions from Smith's university peers, one of the most amusing of which appears in a June issue of the ISIS in 1914. G.B. Smith, whose manner is rather too familiar to find favor among the omnipotent officers, has Mallet remarked to Prince President in stage whisper during a particularly intimate, almost heart-to-heart passage, "Who the deuce is this fellow?" It seems that Smith's personality was perhaps far less formal than others, which apparently left some of his stuffier Edwardian peers unenthused, making him something of an outsider, despite the praise for some of his more successful speeches. There are hints of an evolution in Smith's public persona in response to the war. An apparent change in tone can be construed from reports given of Smith's responses in Michaelmas term 1914. The Union meetings continued after the declaration of war on Germany in early August, although in more modest, informal form. Naturally, world events impacted the topics of these debates, and G.B. Smith, in what was his final term as a student, continued to take part in discussions. Now training with the Oxford University Officer Training Corps, which he joined in October, Smith's role as a student was now overshadowed by what was to be his new vocation as an officer in Kitchener's army. A newfound sobriety is suggested in the Oxford Magazine's account of one of his Union performances during this period. In response to the motion that there is no such thing as international morality, the first of what the editor dubbed the war debates, Smith is directly quoted as saying he came to pick England out of the mire. However, the report critiques that he would have done it better had he been a little less sepulchral. This characterization of Smith's speech as sepulchral stands at odds with the more typical levity and wit of his other responses, evidence that the shadows of responsibility were looming over his once more carefree existence. Even so, some at least wry humor returns in his final speech to the November 5th Union meeting in response to the motion that democracy is incompatible with military efficiency. The Oxford Magazine's editor was rather confused and delightfully ambiguous in his assessment of Smith's presumably sarcastic address in support of the motion. It is uncertain whether G.B. Smith, Corpus, was making fun of the House, or the motion, or himself, but it is certain he spoke third. The sepulchral mood exhibited in Smith's October speech recurs in some of his war-era letters to Tolkien, expressing sometimes quite dark pessimism about his own survival. In one of the most poignant passages from one of these epistles, Smith reframes a famous parable about the brevity of life, taken from Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, dated to 731, contemporizing its didactic content for the bleak atmosphere of a war-torn continent. Truly, this life is not like your Anglo-Saxon sparrow, in straight flight through the lighted hall. Our modern sparrow is driven from pillar to post, chased by beasts of prey, worried by small boys. That is what has become of Europe. Despite sentiments such as these, Smith still found comforts, even on the Somme. These included the consolations of myth, legend, and music. In contrast with his interests in domestic and foreign affairs and history, the latter of his chosen course of study at Oxford, even requesting history books while in France, Smith also deeply appreciated more fanciful escapism. His sentiments may have inspired thoughts expressed decades later by Tolkien in his lecture-turned-essay on fairy stories, which defends and praises fantasy literature as an escape for the prisoner. Smith speaks warmly of such material while serving on the Western Front, proving the Oxford University Gazette's comment in a review of A Spring Harvest 2 years after his death, stating that even in the trenches, no amount of discomfort or danger could spoil his sunny temper or kill his interest in literature. Even after an enemy aircraft bombed his trench, Smith cheerily related, "I am reading slowly that immortal treasury, the Fairy Queen. It is a mind full of visions, and the language is a delight." In another letter, he states, "I am reading the Mabinogion. It doesn't seem to have lost for me any of its ancient charm." A charm which John Garth has noted inspired him to mimic that work's superlative triads for humorous anecdote elsewhere in another war letter. Smith found consolation and inspiration in his friend Tolkien's 1915 elegiac legend, Coterion Among the Trees, which for him reinforced a belief that beauty and imagination can transcend death and destruction. "You know as well as I do, my dear John Ronald, that I don't care a damn if the Bache drops half a dozen high explosives all around and on top of this dugout I am writing in, so long as people go on making verses about Coterion among the trees and such other topics. That indeed is why I am here, to keep them and preserve them." Smith later returns the favor by using an episode from Norse myth as a testament to the inseparability of the TCBS members, even after death. Seeking to console Tolkien after Robert Gilson's death in the catastrophic battle of July 1st, 1916, Smith declares the TCBS as permanently inseparable as Thor and his hammer, a comment laden with more significance than immediately apparent. In Thrymskvida, one of the mythological poems from the poetic Edda, Thor's hammer is stolen and held by the giant Thrym. Through disguise and trickery, Thor, with the help of his two-faced accomplice, Loki, managed to retrieve it. Knowing well his friend's appreciation for this mythology, even more poignantly, Smith may also have been aware that Robert Gilson, as a child, made his own adaptation of the story of the stolen Mjolnir. The Bodleian Library contains a facsimile of Gilson's handwritten book containing his 1903 play, Thor's Journey. This was very possibly made known to his closest friends later in life, and so infuses Smith's reference with an added dimension of unexpected biographical relevance to the friend Smith and Tolkien had just lost. Smith's mythic allusion also points obliquely to life after death, a belief expressed more overtly in his commemorative poem on Gilson, Let Us Tell Quiet Stories of Kind Eyes, which ends with Gilson's spirit returning to visit his surviving friends. Joining Smith's consolations in myth and heroic romance during wartime was that of hearing and reflecting on music. Chopin spoke to me the other night, as he used to speak before the war, Smith writes in spring 1916, of revivifying melodies that inspired him to write home for a copy of Homer's Odyssey. Music is just below the surface in his verse, as the Oxford University Gazette's review of A Spring Harvest attributes a true singing quality to his pre-war lyrics. One of his war poems, sent back to England to be published in his college's journal, The Pelican Record, depicts birdsong transcending even hate and war. His final piece of writing, published during his lifetime, a letter to the editor of London's Saturday Review, appears in a late November issue, a mere 4 days before he was wounded by shrapnel, and just over a week before his death on December 3rd. It responds to others in the same periodical making a case against German music. In one, British composer Joseph Holbrook argued that there is not the slightest need in the Isles for German music, that everyone could do well without Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, Brahms, Strauss, and the rest for the next 10 years. Holbrook also excoriates the German fetish in Britain, which continues despite the war. Smith, apparently an avid reader of the Saturday Review while in France, directly responds to another later letter that addresses Holbrook's, which had suggested trial concerts for new composers. Smith's thought-provoking, somewhat wistful letter coming from, as he calls himself, an exile in a foreign land, is necessarily without specific address, coming from in the field. The piece will be read here in full. Sir, will you allow me, an exile in a foreign land, one word on the subject of German music? I suppose that we out here may be permitted to have some opinion. And first, why does almost nobody writing in your columns mention Bach? Who in the last year or two has exalted Beethoven to this too dizzy height? I knew a man once who said that Beethoven was the beginning of the decline. There, at any rate, was no fool. Herein seems to be the conclusion of the whole matter. The war has done good in that it has dispelled the indiscriminate halo that ringed the heads of all German composers, the feeling that Strauss must be great because he was German. It has enabled us to lop off with a very honest axe much of Schumann, and I hope still more of Wagner. But go too far, and false patriotism begins. We must never let ourselves be separated from the immortal tradition in which Bach was the supreme figure, and Mozart and Beethoven followed. For so would all our music be like a house builded on sand. Imagine literature if we put away forever from our eyes the Greeks and all they wrote and did. It is like cutting yourself off from the fountainhead. You don't even get enough water to wash. Without the past, there can be no future. Without Praxiteles, no Botticelli. For history is not so much connection of thing with thing as the flow of a river from place to place, and knows the like necessities. Without Bach, I dread lest the very interesting works of our new composers may not in a generation or two produce either a very insane or very dull school, nobody will want to hear, and everybody may have to. Wherefore, let us above all avoid Mr. Evans' suggestion of a series of Carnegie concerts. If there is one thing that you must not do to your young composer, it is set him in a hothouse. The only lessons in the world worth learning are lessons learnt in fighting. No man ever got any good out of the viva voces of coldly encouraging dons after Oxford examinations. No man will ever get any good out of the production of his works at a Carnegie concert. Take care of the old, and the new will, if it is any good, take care of itself. I am, sir, Geoffrey Bache Smith. Smith's analogy, imagining the historical continuity of artistic inheritance as the flow of a river from place to place, suggests that knowledge of illustrious predecessors is fundamental for successful and lasting artistic invention. While Tolkien may have never read his friend's final public epistle, the letter in many ways memorializes the discussions, values, and dreams of the TCBS, with its concerns with literature, art, music, and idealistic reform. Smith's reflections on the past, enriching the present in art and music, are realized in his surviving friend's mythology, built on the ruins of older myths, legends, and romances, a mythology which, taken care of and being enriched by the old, has endured, just as Smith believed such works would. This letter from an exile in a foreign land displays G.B. Smith's matured wisdom and nobility of character. Well aware of the black cloud the war had cast over the reputation of German composers, Smith gently reproves those who, like English composer John Holbrook, summarily dismissed the music of the nation they were at war with. Eloquently challenging such false patriotism, Smith's dignified defense, coming from one who had lost many friends and fellow soldiers on the Somme battlefields, has added weight and poignancy for its fair-mindedness and generosity of spirit. This epilogue to an all too brief writing career ends on an unexpectedly didactic note, one pictorially realized in this final photograph of G.B. Smith, back row center, whose countenance is marked by stern and sober resolve. His statement that the only lessons in the world worth learning are lessons learnt in fighting promotes fortitude forged through enduring hardship, over praise and opportunities as the best training for the aspiring artist. This was realized in the life of his surviving friend Tolkien, whose writings, in Tolkien's own words, were quickened to full life by war. These sentiments were a far cry from the attitudes and habits of Smith's youth, the man who, before the war, as John Garth has observed, was naturally undisciplined, whose training as an officer was contrary to his guiding spirit, transformed, in a relatively short space of time, into someone for whom grave responsibilities, however harrowing, were regarded as opportunities for growth and sapient reflections for the benefit of others. Smith's words, coming so soon before his death, resonate still more deeply as the crescendo to the fast disappearing presence of the TCBS on the Western Front, following Gilson's death on July 1st, 1916, and Tolkien's removal due to illness back to England in October of that year. His sober reflections, like his witty contributions to school and university debates, were redolent of those of so many of his generation lost at this time. And in closing, Beverly Nichols, a post-war editor of the ISIS, who had idealistically hoped to restore it to its pre-war glory, later admitted a sense that a note in the Oxford Orchestra was missing with the absence of his fallen peers. In its conclusion to its 1918 review of Smith's verse, the Oxford University Gazette appropriately commemorates the poet in musical terms as no mere occasional singer stung into verse by the force of events, but one who sang for singing's sake and because he must, a true artist with unknown possibilities of development. Music, war, and loss, it seems, were inexorably linked for those who died in and those who survived the Great War. Smith's poems are, to borrow a line from his The Interlude, truly songs that die not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grace. So we have got about 20 minutes for 25 minutes of discussion. I will invite you to ask questions, make comments on the two presentations, and maybe I think we don't need to ask them to come here on the stage, so we'll ask them to speak a bit loud with a loud voice, so everybody hears. Please. Otherwise, I have a few questions, okay, but I don't want to monopolize. Please, Mark, let's start.
Grace, thank you very much for doing that. And the interesting things on music. I wanted to ask a very small question, which was, is there anything more to say? Perhaps I didn't quite catch what you were saying. You said there was some connection between G.B. Smith and Tolkien's poem on sea longing.
Yes.
So could you say anything more about that?
So it's the house. It's the one called the House of Elf. It's only one stanza of it is reproduced in that periodical. Elsewhere, it's actually a two-stanza poem. And I just made the very general comparisons. It's mentions of sea longing and an isle in the sea, which are recurring elements in Peter Smith's verse. Evoke Tolkien, one of the key elements of Tolkien's anthology is the lonely isle. Sea longing being present in many ways, actually. So yes, obviously.
I jump on this because that's a poem which I found very intriguing. The name, it's a poem which is named after a short story by Stevenson, House of Eld, which is quite an interesting short story because you have a few children that are trapped in a house and they cannot escape. So in the short story, the sea is the sort of the voice of freedom coming from afar and kind of calling, summoning these children to freedom. There is a clear idea in the hypertext, in the model of this poem, which is clearly, I think, an allusion to of the idea of escapism again. Okay, so the voice of the sea is acting as a summon of the prisoner going out, and I would say something on this tomorrow. But I think I always been struck by the fact that if you think about Smith or Wootton Major, okay, whose protagonist is named after Smith, at the end of the day, there is the same sort of dynamics of going out into fairy. And the analogy of the sea, the call of the sea, and the house where one is trapped, it became very easily applied to the concept of fairy and the material world, I think. But
I think that's a recurring thing.
It's very recurring.
The wind and the sea is the motif in both poems. I think I'll be talking about it.
Well, yeah, so we are. But this is a work in progress, so I think it's good to start the conversation. I have a couple of questions, one from John. Oh, yes, please, Grace.
John, do you know for sure if it's Bache?
I've been told that by someone whose surname is Bache and is a relation.
Wonderful, because that's always the question, isn't it?
It was my question to him. Yeah, it's the first Bache that I've actually met. So I used to say Bar. But it's a dialect word for a street, Beck.
Which is what it means in German, I spelled that.
Right.
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you both. I just have a very brief question for John. You did mention that at one point, G.B. Smith wrote about Arthur and so his possible historical existence, I think. Was this like a brief thing at one point during the studies, or there's like a constant?
What I was speaking about was a paper that he presented to the school, school or college, I forget now, Literary Society. So if Smith wrote on this, it may well have just been for that paper. But who knows what he wrote? You know, we don't have it. One of the poignant things about his war record is that it includes a list of stuff that he left, sent back to his mother. You know, and among them is notebooks. You know, so it's so tantalising to think that they, you know, would probably have existed maybe up to his mother's death, 1945, I think. But looking at the realities of the family tree, there are no close relatives who are likely to have inherited things at that point. So.
Can I ask you a question? Start with the question myself. Why do you think you applied to study history? Because I think that your definition of G.B. Smith as an aesthetic intellectual, if you want, I mean, I think it's that's what we feel when we read his poetry. But he did not apply to study classics or to study English, but history. How do you?
Well, so at school, King Edward's school was divided into a classics stream and a kind of commercial stream, practical stream. And Gilson, Tolkien, and Wiseman were all on the classic side, and Smith was on the commercial side. And I presume he was put there because of his family background, with the idea that he would, you know, perhaps carry on the family business in some way. So that would have made him perhaps incapable of taking a classics degree here. So history, well, maybe that, like Tolkien, Smith didn't know there was an English course here to be taken. You know, it was a new course. It had only begun in the 1890s. It wasn't well known, yeah, so maybe history just seemed an appropriate arts degree for someone who perhaps wanted a career in the home service, in the home office or whatever. You know. Yeah.
Thank you.
But certainly for someone with a sense of part, you know, clearly the past mattered a lot to Smith in the way that, you know, it does to Tolkien and to Alboin Errol in Tolkien's unfinished time travel novel, The Lost Road. He says that, you know, his longest desire has been to visit the past, to walk in time, or to survey the past as if from an airship.
Thank you. That's a question to Grace. If I remember correctly, even Tolkien himself was a member of the Oxford Union, isn't it?
Yes.
Did you find any evidence of him attending debates, or speaking at debates, but do we have any evidence whatsoever that he actually did make something of his affiliation with the Oxford Union or not?
Well, the difficult thing about the records is all of them, whether it's the proceedings of the Union Society, which are don't give very much information, or the actual periodicals, is they really are only saying who spoke, who responded to emotion. It's important to remember that those events had large numbers of students present, could be up to 1,000, sometimes over, but several hundred. And so there are always many people. Most of those people are not speaking at all. And so they don't say who attended. They only say who gave the motion and who responded to the motion. And so it's a mystery whether, I would presume that, especially that Tolkien was involved, as John Garth said, in his school, the debating society. I'm sure that he attended sometimes. However, he had such a vivacious, very busy life at Exeter College with student societies, which Tolkien and John Garth has written about, and Tolkien and Exeter College. So it is very likely that he perhaps was less involved in the union than he would have because of all of those distractions. But I'm sure he didn't waste his membership and never go, ever. It's just possible that he didn't attend as frequently and didn't feel like speaking, but obviously Smith really enjoyed speaking. So yeah, that answers your question.
You can kind of imagine Tolkien going along to see Smith speak, can't you? At least occasionally.
Quick question for John. Do we know anything at all about Roger, his older brother? He's a rather shadowy figure.
So he was an auctioneer's apprentice before he joined the army. He joined the South Wales Borderers, and you know, with that kind of universal soldier element. Shockingly, he died in Bache,
Yes.
in Iraq. So you know, he could have been in a war like 90 years later and done the same. And one line from Ruth Smith's letter to Wiseman that I was quoting from, she goes on to talk about the circumstances of Roger's death. And she says that he saw a soldier wounded and went to rescue him and was fatally wounded doing so. And she says that both of her sons gave so much to others. You know, this was absolutely true of both of them. She says that Roger will never have heard about Geoffrey dying, because he died too soon to have received any letters about it.
So he didn't go to Gaff as part of that circle.
Well,
what did he?
there's a Roger
Oh,
Smith.
he was there.
Yeah,
Right, oh, no, sorry, his name.
but I've not come across his name in the chronicle, to my memory. So it may be that he was a bit like Hilary Tolkien, who was also a king after school, but left no mark on the school whatsoever. You know, just wasn't that kind of personality. So he looked up to G.B. Smith, I would say. So, yeah.
Dimitrios?
Yeah. Thank you for both the talks. Thank you so much. I would like to ask Grace something about coming back to the sea logging we mentioned before. And I'm wondering if we could study actually more concerning the key elements on Tolkien and Smith at the same time, how water functions sometimes as a protector or sometimes as a punishment. For example, at the fall of Numenor, and if we could see if they are actually classical references or maybe biblical in a way, in some way.
Well, specifically with the water imagery?
Water, yes.
I mean, obviously water is very common in all forms of literature. I haven't really looked deeply into Smith's sources specifically, except a little bit of the Arthurian background. But there is certainly very, very developed mythology of and legends of sea voyages in the Middle Ages and that sort of thing. So there's certainly medieval and classical as well. I don't focus on that as much. Yes.
Yeah, I just had a quick question for Grace. You talked on this slide here about Smith's article about the Catholic German music.
Yes.
Are you aware of there's some work you've done on the British and German music culture during the First World War in 1600 at the moment?
Oh, there is?
Yes.
So this is an ongoing project?
Yeah, there's a PhD student looking at the two different Philharmonic orchestras and other something national. Do you think any of this feeds into the national debate? Was there a national debate going on?
Yes, there was, yes. One key point that really drove the controversy was there was a real song called The Hymn of Hate, composed by Lissauer, his name Ernst Lissauer, and it was very well known. And it's not the only reason why, of course, but there was actually a history of militarized music, so it wasn't just a matter of not liking a composer because they were ethnically German, but also there was actually one very, very, very famous case of a very militant song being used, which actually I found hints of in Tolkien's mythology in some of the history of Middle-earth volumes there are hints of this. So it definitely was a part of the national discourse. These are just a few editorials that I've mentioned, but it was certainly a discussion point, and as these editorials and letters show, there were a variety of views on it. It's just very interesting seeing Smith, who was actually on the Western Front, debating those who are on the home front and taking that perspective. But yes, it certainly was seemed to be a fairly major issue at the time.
I have a question for both of you, or any of you. Because you mentioned legend, myth, story as a constellation in the war race. Also, you, John, I think you have mentioned something related to Smith's beliefs. And however that goes, Tolkien, and those who have been seeds for Tolkien's on fairy stories later on. And very clearly in fairy stories, Tolkien makes a connection with more of his personal beliefs and Christian theology to stories, offering us a glimpse of that evangelium. So I wonder if Smith also connected somehow, or had made any kind of connection between myth and mythology and a more spiritual, represented worldview or theology.
Or do you want both of us to answer? So are you asking us about Smith specifically?
Yes, Smith specifically.
Yeah. Well, Smith's views, I would say, evolved. He was nominally Church of England, but then during the war, there's evidence in his letters that he developed more of an active faith and being on the Western Front. He would sometimes express this directly, but he would also rely on myth and legend as well to express these beliefs, or to he'd also just have very general verses where we have Gilson the Spirit return, which isn't Gilson returning from heaven as such, but it is him waking from the grave and coming forth. So he had a way of displaying it in different ways, sometimes in directly religious ways, sometimes in more mythic, legend, or legendary, or even what we might say generally metaphysical way that's not really specifically Christian. So it varied quite a bit depending on which poem you're considering. I think there is something about using, and obviously this influenced Tolkien, the idea of myth and legend speaking to deeper concerns about life and death and immortality and the afterlife, which whatever someone's particular beliefs were, there are many soldiers on the Western Front who mythologize the war in their verse. And a very famous case is Siegfried Sassoon mentioned a Valhalla with, I think it was battalions scarred by hell. And so there's definitely, and there are even more dramatic cases as well in other lesser known poems as well. So Smith was in a way captured here. He captured those who had none to little faith, but then also those who had more. And I think depending which of his poems you read, you get different insights into the different sorts of ways that soldier poets dealt with death and immortality and the afterlife. So it's quite interesting in that way to compare him to other poets at the time.
Thank you.
Very good.
Little to add to that, really. I think he read his letters and his poetry more recently than I have. My sort of sense is that there's also a side of Smith that was very, very stricken by the war, and would see that in mythological terms that were quite despairing. So he talks about the god of battle. He talks about, you know, this sacrifice of blood outpoured. And yet, on the other hand, after Gilson's death, and maybe Gilson's death came before those lines I'm recalling there, it's Tolkien who says, you know, I thought that the TCBS were going to work as a foursome and that God planned it that way, but now one of them's dead, that can't be so. And Smith was furious with him. So there you see that Smith was the one who was holding on to, you know, a sense of divine destiny, and Tolkien was being a realist. So, you know, maybe we have pendulum swings going on here, which wouldn't seem at all surprising to me. And it's an interesting thing, isn't it, to look at lyric poetry as being kind of like a diary of moments, moods, rather than a crafted body of work.
Thank you.
That can be frustrating, of course, with Smith, because we don't know when he wrote so many of the poems and what order they should be in. That would be. Yeah, it's mysterious to me, but I'm keen to find out more about the history of the spring harvest.
And I think that's exactly what we're going to do in a way after the break, because I think Alonso will lead us into the history of spring harvest. So at this point, I think it's time to wrap up this first session. I'm very grateful to the speakers. I will give them an applause again. So you can see how the structure of the conference begins with 2 sessions on the life, and then tomorrow, if you want, we'll delve into the collection. Okay, but we'll finish with another great speaker after the break. It's 4:55 now, so I will say 25 minutes. At 5:20, we reconvene again. Now we can go out, and there will be some refreshments, tea, coffee, biscuits, water, and possibly juice. See you in 25 minutes.